The sun over the Arizona Territory in the year of our Lord 1874 was not a source of warmth, but a brazen hammer beating down upon the land. It bleached the very color from the sky, leaving a pale, cruel blue that offered no comfort and no promise of rain. Beneath it, the earth was burned 100 shades of red, from soft ochre to the deep, angry color of a dried wound. A line of canvas-topped wagons, 20 in all, sat motionless in the heat, the oxen panting in their yokes, their tails flicking uselessly at clouds of persistent flies. They were a fragile island of civilization in an ocean of silence and stone, bound for the promised green of California, but stalled here in this purgatory of dust. Evelyn Thorne felt the judgment of the sun and the sky as a physical weight, but it was nothing compared to the judgment of the people gathered before her. They stood in a grim semicircle, the men with their hats in their hands, not out of respect, but as if preparing for a graveside service. The women stood with their arms crossed, their faces pinched into masks of pious certainty. They were a jury, and the verdict had been reached long before the trial began. At the center of the ark stood her husband, Jedediah Thorne. He was a man built of hard angles and harder convictions, a merchant who measured the world in profit and loss, in assets and liabilities. Evelyn, he had decided, was a liability. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on some distant point in the shimmering heat haze, as if addressing the unforgiving landscape itself. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the still air like a shard of glass. He spoke of a stain upon his name, an impurity brought into their company. He spoke of a trust betrayed, of whispers and a shared glance with a young man named Samuel Page, a hired hand who had been dismissed from the train a week prior. Jedediah painted a picture with his words, a lurid tale of clandestine meetings and broken vows. It was a fiction woven from a single thread of truth. Evelyn had indeed spoken to young Samuel. She had asked him about his family in Ohio, had shared a cup of water with him on a particularly grueling day. She had offered him a moment of kindness, and in this hard land, her husband and his followers had twisted kindness into a mortal sin. Evelyn stood alone, the dust clinging to the hem of her dark traveling dress, a garment made for the cool parlors of Boston and wholly unsuited for this furnace. She wanted to scream that he was lying, that his pride was a more monstrous thing than any transgression she could ever imagine, but her throat was a knot of dust and terror. Her words, when they came, were a mere whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. She asked him, how could he do this? How could he believe this? Jedediah turned his eyes on her then, and they were as flat and lifeless as river stones. He told her that he saw what he saw. What mattered was not her denial, but the preservation of decency and order. He was a man of property, and she was his property, a damaged good to be discarded. He looked toward the wagon master, a gaunt, sun-weathered man named Silas Blackwood. Silas was a practical man, a leader who had buried more than one settler on this long, hard road. His face was a mask of grim reluctance, but his duty was to the whole, not the one. He gave a short, sharp nod. The decision was made. Jedediah stepped forward. He did not touch her. He simply reached into the back of their wagon, his wagon, and pulled out a small leather satchel. It contained her brush, a change of linen, and a small, leather-bound book of poetry her father had given her. He tossed it into the dust at her feet. The sound was soft, a dull thud that sealed her fate. He then turned, climbed onto the driver's seat of the wagon, and took up the reins. He did not look back. He gave a sharp call to the oxen, and the heavy wheels began to groan, to turn, to crush the red earth, one by one. The other wagons followed suit, the people she had traveled with for months, the women she had shared meager meals with, the children she had told stories to. All turned their faces away. Martha Gable, a woman whose own son Evelyn had nursed through a fever, stared straight through her as their wagon rolled past. her lips a thin, unforgiving line. Evelyn stood frozen, watching the caravan pull away. She watched as it became smaller and smaller, the white canvas tops like receding sails on a sea of red dust. The sounds of their departure, the creak of wood, the lowing of the oxen, the crack of the whip, faded until all that was left was the vast, humming silence of the desert. The dust they had kicked up hung in the air for a long time, a gritty, golden veil between her and the world that had cast her out. When the last wagon had disappeared over the horizon, a profound and terrifying stillness settled over the land. The silence was not empty. It was full of the sun's oppressive weight and the low, constant hum of insects. A dry wind began to stir, whispering through the sparse, thorny scrub and picking up grains of sand that stung her cheeks. It was a lonely, mournful sound, the earth's own sigh. She looked down at the satchel at her feet, then out at the landscape that was now her home and her prison. Red rock mesas rose in the distance, their flat tops stark against the pale sky. They looked like altars built for forgotten, merciless gods. Closer, the ground was littered with the leavings of a harsh existence. The skeletal remains of a coyote lay half buried in the sand, its bones bleached to an ivory white, a testament to the desert's final victory over all living things. A hawk circled high overhead, a black speck riding the thermal currents, a patient observer. A wave of nausea and disbelief washed over her. It was a dream, a terrible nightmare from which she would soon awake. She would be back in the wagon, the familiar scent of canvas and dust around her. Jedediah's heavy breathing a steady rhythm in the dark, but the heat on her skin was real. The thirst that was beginning to parch her throat was real. The profound, soul-crushing loneliness was real. She sank to her knees, the rough fabric of her dress scratching against the dry, cracked earth. The betrayal was a physical pain, a hot poker in her chest. It was not just Jedediah. It was all of them. They had known her. They had spoken to her, prayed with her. And yet, they had discarded her as easily as one would discard a worn-out shoe. Their community, their faith, their civilization. It was all a fragile pretense, a thin veneer of order that shattered at the first sign of inconvenience. They had traded her life for their peace of mind. And what of her own judgment? A cold dread, different from the fear of the desert, coiled in her stomach. She had trusted him. She had stood before a minister in a white dress and promised to honor and obey Jedediah Thorne, a man her father had chosen for his wealth and standing. She had ignored the coldness in his eyes, the possessive way he held her arm, the dismissive tone he used when she spoke of books or ideas. She had told herself it was a woman's duty to adapt, to be compliant, to find contentment in her station. She had silenced the small, insistent voice within her that whispered of a different kind of life, a life of her own choosing. She had made a bargain with her own soul, and this was the price. She no longer trusted any of them, but worse, she no longer trusted herself. Her own choices had led her here, to this desolate place, alone, with nothing but a book of poems and a future that would likely be measured in hours, not days. The woman who had believed in goodness, in fairness, in the strength of community, had died on this patch of red dirt. A new creature was being born in her place, one forged in betrayal and fear. Slowly, shakily, she got to her feet. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was a mockery. The desert was putting on its finest colors for her execution. She picked up the satchel, its familiar weight a small, cold comfort in her hand. She looked in the direction the wagons had gone, then in the opposite direction, toward the jagged, shadowy mountains. Both paths led to nowhere. She was Evelyn Thorne no more. That name belonged to a foolish woman from Boston who was married to a cruel man. She was just a soul now, stripped bare of everything but the primal, desperate need to draw one more breath. And then another. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay here, on the spot of her own unmaking. She took a step, and then another, her small, dark figure moving slowly across the vast, indifferent stage of the painted desert, her shadow stretching long and thin behind her, the only companion she had left. Time in the desert did not pass in hours, but in suns. The first sun rose and set, a brutal cycle of fire and ice. By day, Evelyn walked until her city-bred shoes were shredded and her feet were a raw, blistering agony. By night, she huddled behind a rock, the cold a predatory thing that seeped into her bones, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She had finished the small amount of water from the canteen Jedediah had not thought to take from her satchel within the first few hours. Now, a thirst unlike anything she had ever known had taken root, a dry, rasping fire in her throat, and a dull ache behind her eyes. The second sun was a fever dream. The world shimmered and warped before her. The red rocks took on the shapes of familiar Boston storefronts, only to melt back into stone as she drew closer. She saw a pool of clear, cool water just ahead, its surface sparkling, and she wept with relief, stumbling forward until she fell, her hands finding only hot sand. She spoke to her father, her voice a cracked whisper, assuring him she was fine, that Jedediah was a good man, that she was happy. The words were lies, and the desert drank them up without comment. Her hunger had become a hollow ache, but it was nothing compared to the all-consuming madness of her thirst. On the morning of the third day, she knew she was dying. She had crawled into the sliver of shade offered by a gnarled, skeletal tree and did not have the strength to rise again. The world had shrunk to a small circle of dust and her own labored breathing. The sky was a white-hot sheet above her. The thought came to her, an absolute certainty she was going to die. She wondered if the hawk she had seen earlier would be the first to find her. A strange sense of peace settled over her. There was no more betrayal, no more judgment, only the end. It was then that she saw him. He was a silhouette on the high ridge to the east, a figure on horseback, as still and silent as the rock formations around him. He was too far away to make out any details, yet his presence was an immense, profound weight in the empty landscape. He was not a mirage. The shape was too solid, too defined against the burning sky. For a long moment, he simply sat there, watching. She did not know if he was watching her specifically, or merely surveying his domain. Fear, a feeling she thought had been burned out of her, returned as a cold trickle in her veins. Was this a new tormentor, another agent of this cruel land? Cayanez had been tracking a small band of pronghorn when he first saw the flicker of movement below. It was the wrong kind of movement, clumsy and erratic, not the fluid grace of a desert creature. He guided his paint horse to the edge of the mesa, his eyes, accustomed to reading the subtle language of the land, narrowing to focus on the shape. It was a woman, a white woman, alone. His first instinct was suspicion, a feeling as old and deep as his own memory. The whites did not travel alone in this land, and they did not travel on foot unless something was terribly wrong. It could be a trap, a lure set by the blue-coated soldiers who still hunted his people like animals. He remained motionless, a part of the landscape, letting the sun and the silence be his scouts. He watched her stumble, saw the dark fabric of her impractical dress, a blot of mourning against the vibrant earth. He saw her fall and not get up. A deep, cold resentment stirred in him. These people, the Bilagana, came to this land and broke it. They scarred it with their wagon wheels, dirtied its sacred springs with their cattle, and filled the air with their noise and their greed. They had taken everything from his family. They had driven them from the green valleys and forced them into hiding in these harsh, hidden canyons. They had brought war and sickness and starvation. This woman was one of them. She was the enemy. The land itself was claiming her, and it was a just, fitting end. He should turn his horse and ride away, leaving her to the sun and the scavengers. It was what her people deserved. But he continued to watch. He saw her crawl into the shade. He saw the slight, shuddering rise and fall of her shoulders. She was not a soldier. She was not a threat. She was a living thing, dying under the same sun that gave life to the corn and the squash. His grandfather, a man of great wisdom, had taught him that you do not stand by and watch a deer suffer in a trap. Even if you did not set it, there was a balance to the world, an order that was greater than hatred. Leaving her would be a choice born of bitterness, and bitterness was a poison that killed the soul, with a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 sorrows. He nudged his horse forward, picking his way carefully down the steep, rocky incline. Evelyn's vision was blurring, the edges turning dark. The figure on the ridge had disappeared. Perhaps it had been a mirage after all. The buzzing in her ears grew louder, drowning out the sound of her own heartbeat. The last thing she saw was the pale, cruel sky, and then the darkness took her completely. She awoke to a strange sensation, a coolness on her lips, a hint of moisture, sweet and earthy. Her eyes fluttered open. A face was hovering over hers, so close she could see the pores in his sun-darkened skin, the intricate lines at the corners of his eyes. The face was framed by long, black hair, held back from his brow by a simple leather band. His features were stark, carved from the same red rock as the canyons. His expression unreadable, intense. He was a Navajo man. Panic, primal and absolute, seized her. The stories she had heard on the long journey west, whispered around campfires in hushed, fearful tones, flooded her mind. Tales of capture, of savagery, of a fate worse than death. She tried to scream, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. She pushed herself backward, scrambling in the dust, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, and the world tilted violently. The man did not move. He simply watched her with those dark, unsettling eyes. He held a piece of a green, fleshy plant in his hand, its pulp shredded. He had been squeezing its life-giving moisture onto her lips. Now, he straightened up and offered her a water skin, made from the hide of some animal. He held it out, a silent offering. Evelyn stared at the water skin as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Her body screamed for the water, but her mind screamed of danger. She looked at him, at his buckskin leggings, his bare chest, the knife sheathed at his belt. He was everything she had been taught to fear. He was the savage from the stories, the embodiment of this wild, untamed land. Kaya watched the fear in her eyes, the way she recoiled from him. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of settlers whose farms he had scouted, in the faces of soldiers before a battle. It was a look of hatred born from ignorance. He felt the familiar contempt rise in him. She was weak, pathetic. Look at her. Her fine dress torn, her skin blistered and raw. Her people thought they could own this land, but they could not even survive in it for 3 days. They were children, playing with forces they did not understand. He almost took the water skin back. Let her die. But the image of his younger sister, Tala, her face thin from hunger during the long walk, flashed in his mind. He would not have let his sister die of thirst. He could not let this woman die either, no matter who she was. He set the water skin on the ground, pushing it a few inches toward her with the toe of his moccasin. Then he stood and walked a short distance away, turning his back to her, granting her the space to make a choice without the pressure of his gaze. Evelyn watched him, her breath coming in shallow pants. He was taller than she had realized, lean and powerful. His back was a landscape of muscle and old scars. By turning away, he had given her a small measure of power, a choice. Her thirst was a roaring furnace now, a physical pain that overshadowed her fear. Slowly, her hand shaking, she reached for the water skin. It was heavy, and the water sloshed coolly inside. She uncorked the wooden stopper and lifted it to her lips. The water was warm from the sun, but it was the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. She drank in small, careful sips at first, then in desperate gulps, the precious liquid spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her grimy dress. It was life itself. When she could drink no more, she lowered the skin, a deep, shuddering sigh of relief escaping her. The sun was touching the tops of the distant mesas, and the heat of the day was beginning to fade, replaced by a creeping chill. She knew the desert night. It was a different kind of killer, slow and insidious. She could not survive it out here, not in her weakened state. The man turned back to face her. He said nothing. His face was a mask of stone. He walked to his horse, a beautiful animal of brown and white patches, and swung himself into the saddle with an easy, fluid motion. He looked down at her, his expression unchanged. He did not speak, did not gesture. He simply waited, his horse shifting its weight impatiently. The choice was laid bare before her. She could stay here, with the life-giving water he had provided, and face the freezing dark alone. Her end would be slower, but just as certain. Or she could follow this silent, forbidding stranger into a future she could not possibly imagine. He was a savage, perhaps a killer, but he had given her water when he could have left her to die. He was an enemy, but he was also her only hope. The last vestiges of the Boston lady, of the merchant's wife who believed in rules and propriety, withered and blew away like dust. All that was left was a raw, desperate will to live, slowly, painfully, using the trunk of the dead tree for support. She pulled herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, barely able to hold her weight. She took one unsteady step toward him, then another. It was an answer. He watched her approach, his eyes missing nothing. When she was beside the horse, he leaned down and, without a word, gripped her arm. His hand was hard and calloused, his grip strong but not cruel. With an effortless pull, he lifted her up, setting her sideways behind him on the horse's broad back. Her tattered dress bunched around her legs, and she had to grab onto his waist to keep from falling. His skin was warm and solid beneath her hands. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible stiffening of his muscles, then urged the horse into a steady walk, heading toward the darkening canyons as the first stars began to prick the deep violet sky. The horse moved with a steady, tireless rhythm, its hooves making a soft, shuffling sound in the deep sand of the wash. Evelyn clung to the man's waist, her cheek pressed against the hard muscle of his back. Every jolt of the horse's gait sent a fresh wave of pain through her bruised and battered body. They traveled for what felt like hours, moving deeper into a labyrinth of stone. The walls of the canyon rose around them, sheer and silent, blotting out the stars until only a narrow, dark blue ribbon of sky was visible above. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and damp stone and something else, something faintly green and alive. The man, Kaya, as she had heard his people call him, spoke only once, a low word to his horse as he guided it through a narrow opening between two towering monoliths of rock. The passage was barely wide enough for them to pass, and it opened into a hidden bowl, a protected sanctuary carved into the heart of the stone. A small fire burned in the center of a clearing, its light flickering against the walls of several low, dome-shaped dwellings made of mud and wood. A handful of people, perhaps a dozen in all, turned as they entered. Their conversation ceased. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft nicker of the horse. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, a collective weight of suspicion and fear. She was an intrusion, a foreign object in their world of stone and shadow. She saw women clutching their children closer, men whose hands rested near the knives at their belts. Their faces, illuminated by the firelight, were hard and wary. These were not the monstrous caricatures from the campfire stories. They were people, and they were afraid of her. Kaya swung his leg over the horse's neck and slid to the ground. He turned and, with the same impersonal strength he had used to lift her, he helped her down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the earth, and she would have fallen if he had not held her arm. He led her past the silent stairs toward one of the dwellings, a hogan, and pushed aside the heavy blanket that covered the entrance. He nudged her gently inside, into the warm, earthy-smelling dark. A small fire pit in the center held a few glowing embers that cast a dim, red light. A young woman rose from a pile of sheepskins as they entered. She was slender and moved with a quiet grace, her long black hair tied back in a simple knot. She looked from Kaya to Evelyn, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and curiosity. She spoke to him in their language, a soft, flowing sound, her voice questioning. Kaya answered in a low, tired tone. The woman's gaze fell upon Evelyn again, and this time it was different. It was still cautious, but the alarm had been replaced by a deep, assessing stillness. This was Tala, his sister. Tala gestured for Evelyn to sit on a sheepskin. Then she brought her a clay bowl of warm stew. It was thick with corn and pieces of some kind of meat, savory and rich. Evelyn ate slowly, her hands trembling. The simple act of holding the bowl an immense effort. It was the first real food she had had in days, and it was a balm to her empty, aching stomach. When she was finished, Tala gave her a cup of water, then pointed to a pile of skins in the corner. The meaning was clear. Sleep. Evelyn lay down, her body sinking into the soft wool, and pulled a rough woven blanket over herself. Through the open doorway, she could see the silent figures still gathered around the main fire, their dark silhouettes framed against the flames. She was a stranger in their midst, a problem to be discussed. The last thing she heard before exhaustion claimed her was the low murmur of their voices, a language she did not understand, deciding her fate. Over the next few days, Evelyn did little more than sleep and eat. Tala tended to her with a detached sort of kindness, bringing her food and water, changing the makeshift bandages on her raw feet. She never smiled, and she rarely spoke, but her hands were gentle. Evelyn's body began to heal, the blisters on her feet turning to scabs, the sun's fire receding from her skin, the deep ache in her muscles slowly subsiding. But as her physical strength returned, her awareness of her precarious position grew sharper. She was a prisoner, though not in the conventional sense. No one guarded her. The blanket over the doorway was her only barrier, yet the invisible walls of their suspicion were as solid as the canyon rock. When she stepped outside the hogan for the first time, the small community fell silent. Children who had been playing in the dust stopped and stared, then ran to hide behind their mothers' skirts. The women turned their backs, busying themselves with grinding corn or weaving, their movements suddenly stiff and deliberate. The men simply watched her, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. She was an unwelcome ghost in their home. One evening, an old man approached the hogan. His face was a map of deep lines, his hair a shock of white against his dark skin, and he walked with the aid of a gnarled wooden staff. He did not look at Evelyn, but spoke directly to Kaya, who had been sitting outside, sharpening the blade of his knife. The old man's voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. And though Evelyn could not understand the words, the tone was one of stern warning. This was Old Bear, the elder. He gestured once in her direction, a quick, dismissive flick of his hand. He spoke for a long time, his voice rising and falling, a litany of what Evelyn could only assume were her failings, the failings of her entire race. Kaya listened patiently, his head bowed, offering only short, quiet responses. When the old man was finished, he gave Kaya a final, hard look, and then turned and walked away. Kaya did not look at Evelyn. He simply stood and walked out of the camp, not returning until after dark. The message was clear. Old Bear had said what they were all thinking: the white woman would only bring trouble. The realization settled upon her with the cold weight of certainty. She could not stay here like this. A useless mouth to feed. A symbol of the enemy they were hiding from. Jedediah had cast her out because he saw her as a liability. These people saw her the same way. The thought was unbearable. She had to prove them wrong. She had to learn to be of use. She had to learn to survive. Not just in the desert, but here, in this canyon of ghosts. Her education began with failure. She saw how the women would disappear for hours and return with baskets of roots and berries. She tried to follow them one day, but they melted into the landscape of rocks and scrub, and she was left alone, lost within minutes. She managed to find her way back to the camp only by following the thin column of smoke from their fire, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear. She was an infant in this world, unable to even walk without getting lost. Kaya seemed to understand her desperation, though he offered no words of comfort. One morning, he left a piece of flint and a shard of steel outside the hogan, along with a small bundle of dry tinder. Evelyn knew it was a test. She spent the entire morning trying to create a spark, striking the steel against the flint until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. Her soft, city hands were clumsy and weak. She would manage a few meager sparks, but they would die before they could catch in the tinder. Frustration brought tears to her eyes. She was failing at the most basic of human tasks. From across the clearing, Tala watched her. Evelyn was aware of her gaze, a silent, critical judgment. Finally, with a small, exasperated sigh, Tala came over. She did not speak. She simply knelt, took the flint and steel from Evelyn's trembling hands, and with a few deft, expert strikes, sent a shower of hot sparks into the tinder. A tiny flame flickered, and she nurtured it gently, blowing on it until it grew into a small, steady fire. She looked at Evelyn, her expression unreadable, and then walked away. It was not an act of friendship. It was the act of someone tired of watching a child play with dangerous tools, but it was also a lesson, the first she had been offered. Her next lesson was in finding water. She saw Tala walk to a squat, barrel-shaped cactus, its surface covered in a fearsome array of spines. With a sharp knife, Tala sliced off the top, then used a wooden paddle to mash the fleshy pulp inside into a drinkable liquid. A few days later, desperate to contribute something, Evelyn took a knife and tried to do the same. She underestimated the spines. They pierced her hands, dozens of tiny, fiery needles. She cried out in pain and frustration, dropping the knife. She managed to slice into the cactus, but her clumsy efforts yielded only a small, bitter trickle of moisture. It was another failure, another reminder of her utter incompetence. The true turning point came with the rabbit. Kaya had shown her how to make a simple snare from a piece of sinew and a bent stick. He had set it for her the first few days, and a rabbit would be waiting in the morning. But then he stopped. He left the coiled sinew by her sheepskin. The message was unspoken but absolute. If you want to eat meat, you must provide it yourself. It took her 2 days of scouting, of finding a promising trail, of setting the snare again and again, before she was successful. She found the rabbit in the early morning light, caught by its hind leg, twisting and struggling in the snare. Its eyes were wide with terror. Her first instinct was to release it, but she thought of the hungry faces in the camp, of her own gnawing emptiness. This was not a pet. It was survival. With a stone, her hands shaking, she did the necessary deed. The act was brutal and ugly, and it sickened her. But when it was done, she felt a grim sense of accomplishment. She had provided. Skinning it was another ordeal, a messy, bloody business that turned her stomach. But she watched how the other women did it, her shame and revulsion warring with her determination. She cooked the small pieces of meat over her own small, painstakingly created fire. It was tough and slightly scorched, but it was hers. She ate half of it, and the other half she took in a clay bowl and walked over to where Tala was mending a moccasin. She held out the bowl. Tala looked up, her hands stilling. She looked at the cooked meat, then into Evelyn's eyes. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. This was more than an offering of food. It was a plea, a bridge, a question. Am I more than just a white woman? Can I be something else? For a long moment, Tala did not move. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the young woman reached out and took a piece of the meat from the bowl. She put it in her mouth and chewed thoughtfully. She gave a single, small nod. It was not a smile. It was not an invitation to friendship, but it was an acknowledgement. It was an acceptance. In the quiet, hidden heart of the canyon, surrounded by ghosts of the past and the ever-present threat of the future, Evelyn had finally taken her first step away from the woman she had been, and toward the person she would have to become. The fragile peace Evelyn had begun to find in the canyon was shattered by the drumming of a horse's hooves. A young man, one of the camp's keenest scouts, rode into the clearing at a gallop, a dangerous speed in the enclosed space. He slid from his horse before it had fully stopped, his face slick with sweat and pale with fear beneath its sun-darkened surface. He ran to Old Bear and Kaya, speaking in a torrent of low, urgent Navajo. An immediate and chilling change swept through the small community. The quiet industry of the morning vanished, replaced by a silent, focused haste. Women began bundling dried foods into blankets. Children were gathered and quieted, and men moved to secure the small herd of sheep and goats hidden deeper in a side canyon. There was no panic, no wasted motion. It was a grim and practiced dance of survival, a routine they knew all too well. Tala appeared at Evelyn's side, her face a tight mask of anxiety. She spoke a few words of English, words Kaya must have taught her. "Soldiers, close. We go now." The word struck Evelyn with a cold dread. Soldiers, the United States Army. In her old life, that word had meant safety, order, and civilization. Here, in this hidden place, it was a death knell. She looked at these people, at the fear in their eyes, and saw not savages, but a family about to be torn from its home. She hurried back to the hogan, her own small collection of possessions suddenly seeming foolish. A hairbrush, a book of poetry, a spare chemise. She wrapped them in her sleeping blanket and tied it with a piece of sinew, her hands fumbling but determined. She would not be a burden. She would carry her own weight. They left the camp as they had found it, a ghost of a place, leaving behind as little trace as possible. The fires were smothered with sand. The ground swept with branches to obscure their tracks. They moved on foot, leading the animals, melting into the vast, broken landscape of the high desert. Kaya, his face carved from stone, took the lead, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges, his body a study in tense vigilance. Evelyn walked beside Tala, her newly learned endurance put to the test. The sun beat down, and the dust they kicked up coated her throat and skin, a gritty, constant reminder of their flight. For 2 days they traveled, moving mostly at night, resting during the worst of the day's heat in the shadows of overhangs and rock falls. The silence of their journey was heavy, broken only by the bleating of a goat or the cry of a hawk. The tension was a living thing, a predator that stalked them every step of the way. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Kaya led them to a high vantage point overlooking a shallow valley. He held up a hand, and the small column of people and animals froze. He lay flat on the warm rock of the outcrop, inching forward to peer over the edge. Evelyn, her heart pounding, crawled beside him, her fear of heights overcome by a greater fear of the unknown. The valley below was a scene of utter desolation. A small settlement, much like the one she had just left, had been destroyed. The hogans were blackened, smoking shells, their wooden frames reduced to charcoal. The ground was littered with the detritus of a ruined life. A broken pot here. A child's leather doll there. A trampled loom with a half-finished blanket still attached. There was no sign of life. Only silence and the slow, lazy circling of buzzards in the hot sky. And then she saw them. A column of a dozen blue-coated soldiers on horseback, moving away from the ruined village. They were not moving quickly. They were leading a small, pathetic procession. A group of women and children, their hands bound, were being herded along like cattle. A small boy stumbled and fell, and one of the soldiers, without dismounting, prodded him back to his feet with the barrel of his rifle. A wave of sickness and horror washed over Evelyn, so potent it almost made her gag. These were the men of her world, the agents of her civilization. She looked at their uniforms, their polished boots, the flag one of them carried, its colors a garish slash against the muted tones of the desert. She had been taught that these things were symbols of justice and progress, but seen from this high, secret place, they were symbols of a cold and methodical brutality. The men in those uniforms were no different from Jedediah Thorne. They were men who believed in their own righteousness so completely that they could destroy lives, burn homes, and steal children without a flicker of conscience. The carefully constructed walls of her old beliefs crumbled into dust. The people she was with, the Navajo who had taken her in, they were the ones who lived with a quiet dignity, a deep connection to the earth, a fierce loyalty to one another. They were the civilized ones, her people, the ones with the books and the churches and the laws. They were the savages. The truth of it was a bitter, burning acid in her throat. She had been cast out by one world only to see it for what it truly was from the outside, a world built on a foundation of pious cruelty. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she jumped. It was Kaya, pulling her back from the edge of the rock. His face was a mask of cold, familiar grief. He had seen this before. This was the world he had always known. He met her eyes for a brief, searing moment, and in his gaze she saw not just anger, but a profound and weary sorrow. He did not need to say a word. In that shared moment of witness, a silent understanding passed between them. She was no longer just a white woman to him. She was someone who had seen. They retreated from the ridge and continued their flight. The grim image of the destroyed village burned into Evelyn's mind. The mood was somber, the fear now mixed with a fresh and potent grief. They were all in mourning for strangers who were also their family. Late the next afternoon, as they made their way through a narrow, boulder-choked wash, Tala pointed to a patch of green, a type of yucca plant whose roots could be pounded into a soapy lather for washing. They were all grimy with the dust of their travels, and the chance to clean themselves was a small but welcome comfort. While the others rested, Evelyn and Tala took a piece of cloth and a knife and went to gather some of the root. Evelyn was concentrating on digging around the base of a thick plant, her back to the rock wall of the wash. The air was still and hot, the silence broken only by the scrape of her knife against the sandy soil. She did not hear the dry, papery rattle until it was almost too late. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primal, instinctual part of the brain, a sound of pure menace. She froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she lifted her head, coiled not 3 feet from her. Its spade-shaped head raised and its tail a blur of motion, was a large rattlesnake, the color of the dust and rock, perfectly camouflaged. It was poised to strike. Time seemed to slow down. She could see every diamond-shaped pattern on its back, the flicker of its black tongue, the cold, lidless stare of its eyes. A scream was trapped in her throat, a choked, useless knot of terror. She never saw Kaya move. One moment he was 20 feet away, speaking quietly with Old Bear. The next, he was a blur of motion, a silent, swift force of nature. He shoved her hard, sending her tumbling backward into the dust, away from the snake. In the same fluid motion, he brought the flat of his own foot down hard on the snake's head, crushing it against the rock. It was over in a heartbeat. The snake lay dead, its body still twitching. Evelyn lay in the dust, her heart hammering against her ribs, the breath knocked out of her. Tala rushed to her side, helping her sit up, but Evelyn's eyes were on Kaya. He stood over the dead snake, his chest rising and falling, his face grim. He looked down at his own leg. 2 small, angry red dots were welling with blood on his calf, just above the top of his moccasin. The snake had struck him as he had struck it. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Old Bear let out a sharp cry and hurried forward. A snake bite in this remote place was a death sentence. But Kaya shook his head. He pointed to the wound. It was shallow. The fangs had only grazed him. Still, the danger was real. Without thinking, Evelyn scrambled to his side. The fear was gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and a fierce, protective instinct. She looked at the wound. The blood, dark and rich, welled up and dripped into the red dust at his feet. The 2 colors merging, becoming one, blood and dust, life and the earth. She looked up at him. "Let me—" The words were a quiet command, not a request. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers. She saw a flicker of surprise, of hesitation to let her, a white woman, tend to his wound was an act of profound trust. For a breathless moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and sat down on a nearby boulder. Her hands were steady. She took the waterskin Tala offered and poured a small amount onto her cloth. Gently, she began to clean the wound, wiping away the blood and the dust. His skin was warm and taut beneath her fingers. Her touch was firm and clinical, but it was the first time they had touched without a barrier of fear or violence between them. She was not a captive being rescued. He was not a silent, intimidating savior. They were just 2 people under the vast, uncaring sky, one in need of help, the other able to give it. She took her knife, the same one she used to dig roots and skin rabbits, and held the tip in the flame of a hastily built fire until it glowed red. She did not look at him. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. She lanced the 2 small punctures, her movements quick and precise, and then squeezed, forcing more blood out, trying to expel as much of the venom as she could. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, though she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. When she was finished, Tala brought her a poultice of chewed herbs and mud, which she applied to the wound. She wrapped his calf with a clean strip of cloth torn from her own spare chemise. Her hands lingered on the knot for a moment longer than necessary. She could feel the steady, strong pulse of the life beneath her fingertips. She looked up and met his gaze. The mask of stone was gone from his face. In its place was something new, something she could not name. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was a kind of quiet awe, a deep and profound acknowledgement. He had saved her life, and now, in a small way, she had saved his. The scales had been balanced. She was no longer just a helpless outsider. She was a part of their survival. He was no longer just her protector. He was a man, vulnerable and mortal. And in the silent space between them, a fragile thread of trust had been spun, as strong and as vital as life itself. They found shelter as the bruised purple twilight bled across the sky. It was not a true cave, but a deep, scooped-out hollow in the face of a sandstone cliff, a rocky mouth that offered refuge from the relentless wind that had picked up since nightfall. The rest of the small band, weary to the bone, settled themselves deeper within the shelter, wrapping themselves in blankets and seeking the relative warmth of the stone at their backs. A profound exhaustion had settled over them, the kind that comes after days of fear and flight. Kaya's leg was stiff, and he moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, but his strength seemed undiminished. He saw to his horse first, checking the animal's legs and giving it a small portion of grain from a leather pouch. Evelyn watched him, a quiet ache of concern in her chest. The poultice on his calf needed changing, but she did not want to press him, to seem as if she were fussing over him like a Boston physician. She sat a little apart from the others, hugging her knees to her chest, the thin wool of her dress a poor defense against the cold that was creeping out of the rock and descending from the high, star-filled sky. It was a cold that had teeth. It gnawed at the edges of her strength, sinking deep into her marrow. An uncontrollable shiver started in her shoulders and worked its way down her spine. Her teeth began to chatter, a small, betraying sound in the deep quiet of the night. Across the small clearing, Kaya noticed. He had been checking the security of their position, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape below. He turned his head and his gaze found her, huddled and trembling. For a moment, he was still, a dark, unreadable silhouette against the silvered rocks. Then, without a word, he set about building a fire. His movements were economical and sure. He did not seem to be gathering wood so much as conjuring it from the sparse, scrubby vegetation that clung to life in the crevices of the rock. He chose a spot a few feet from where Evelyn sat, a place that would share its warmth but not crowd her. He arranged the kindling with the care of an artist, then struck his flint and steel. A spark caught, a tiny orange jewel in the darkness. He bent low, his long hair falling forward, and blew on it with a soft, steady breath. A small flame wavered, then grew, licking at the larger pieces of wood he fed it. The fire pushed back the oppressive dark and the biting cold. Flames leapt up, casting a warm, dancing light on the sandstone walls, making the shadows retreat and jump. The warmth soaked into Evelyn's skin, a blessed relief that made her sigh. The shivering subsided, leaving behind a deep, resonant weariness. Kaya sat on the other side of the fire, his knees drawn up, his hands resting loosely on them. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of light and shadow, his expression thoughtful. The fire crackled and hissed, a companionable sound in the vast silence of the wilderness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the shared experience of the last few days, the horror of the burned village, the sharp, sudden terror of the snake, the quiet intimacy of her tending his wound, the barriers of race and experience, of fear and suspicion, had been burned away, leaving something new and uncertain in their place. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, rough, a near whisper that carried easily across the small fire. He asked her a question, the one she knew he must have been wondering since he found her. Why did your people leave you? The question was simple, direct, devoid of the judgment or morbid curiosity she would have expected from one of her own kind. He was not asking for gossip. He was asking for a reason, a piece of the puzzle that was her impossible presence in his world. She looked away from his intense gaze, into the heart of the fire. The flames were a swirling chaos of orange and yellow, beautiful and destructive. How could she explain Jedediah's cold pride, the suffocating piety of the wagon train, the sin of a shared cup of water? It was all so complex, so steeped in a world of rules he could never understand. The whole sordid story seemed trivial and ugly here, under the honest stars. She searched for the core of it, for the one true thing that lay beneath all the lies and accusations. She found it, a small, hard kernel of truth she had barely dared to admit to herself. She looked back at him, the firelight catching the unshed tears in her eyes. Her voice was steady, though it cost her a great deal to make it so. Because I dared to want happiness. The words hung in the air between them, simple and yet immense. She had expected him to be confused, to ask for more of an explanation, but he said nothing. He simply held her gaze, his own eyes dark and deep, reflecting the dancing flames. He looked at her for a long, long time, and in that gaze she felt a profound and startling sense of being seen, of being understood, not just with his mind, but with his soul. That simple, desperate wish was a language he knew. His own people had been driven from their green valleys, hunted like wolves, their children stolen, all because they had dared to want the happiness of living in their ancestral homes, of practicing their own faith, of raising their families in peace. Her small, personal tragedy was a single note in the great, sad symphony of his own people's sorrow. He saw the shared wound, the common pain of being punished for wanting the one thing all living creatures crave. The understanding in his eyes gave her the courage to say more. She spoke of her life in Boston, of a home that was a beautiful cage, of a marriage that was a business transaction. She did not speak with self-pity, but with a kind of dawning clarity, as if saying the words aloud for the first time made them real. She told him about her father, a good man who had loved her but had seen her as an asset to be managed. She spoke of Jedediah, of his cold hands and his colder heart, of the way he looked at her as if she were a piece of porcelain, beautiful but easily broken and ultimately replaceable. She was a possession, meant to be pleasing to the eye and to produce an heir, her own thoughts, her own dreams, her own simple desire for a life that was more than a performance, had been an inconvenience, then a flaw, and finally, a crime worthy of exile. When she finished, a profound quiet settled over her. She felt strangely light, as if she had just set down a heavy burden she had been carrying for years. Kaya listened to it all without interruption, his expression never changing, but she felt his attention as a physical presence, a warm, steady focus. After a long silence, he spoke of his own life. His words were few, simple, heavy with loss. He spoke of a time when his people had lived near a river that ran all year, where the corn grew tall and the peaches were sweet. He spoke of his father, a weaver of blankets, a man who could read the stories in the clouds and sing the songs that made the crops grow. He described, in a flat, emotionless tone, the day the soldiers came, the fire, the screams. He did not speak of battles or warriors. He spoke of the smell of burning corn and of never seeing his father again. His was not a story of a single betrayal, but of the betrayal of an entire world. His happiness had not been something he had dared to want. It had been something that was stolen from him, and he had spent his life since then simply trying to survive in the ashes. The gulf between them, the chasm of culture and experience, seemed to vanish, replaced by the shared geography of grief. They were two people from broken worlds, survivors of different kinds of wars, finding a moment of truce in the flickering light of a desert fire. A softer mood settled between them. The deep confessions gave way to a quiet curiosity. Evelyn pointed to the flames. "Fire," she said, her voice soft. He watched her lips, then repeated the word, "Fire." His pronunciation was different. The R sound a low roll in his throat, but the word was clear. She pointed to the rock wall of the cave. Rock, then to the sky, sky. He repeated each word, a patient student. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen anything resembling a smile on his face, and it transformed his stern features, making him look younger, less burdened. Then it was his turn. He spoke a word in his own language, a sound that was both soft and strong. Hozho. He said it meant beauty, balance, harmony. It was not just about what was pretty to the eye. He explained, using a mixture of his own language and a few English words. It was about living in the right way, in balance with the earth, with the holy people, and with one's own spirit. He then taught her a short phrase, a prayer, Hozugo Nasha. It was a prayer to walk in beauty. She tried to repeat the sounds, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar consonants and tones. He corrected her gently, saying the words again, slowly. She tried again, and this time it was closer. He nodded, a look of quiet approval in his eyes. In that moment, she was not a white woman, an intruder. She was a student, and he was a teacher, and they were sharing something sacred, a small piece of a world she had never known existed. The fire burned low, collapsing into a bed of glowing, pulsating embers. The rest of the camp was asleep, their quiet breathing a soft rhythm in the night. The cold was held at bay by the warmth of the coals and the new, unspoken warmth that had grown between them. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the embers pulse like a slow, sleeping heart. Evelyn felt a sense of peace she had not known was possible. She was a hunted fugitive, a castaway, with no home and no future, and yet sitting here in the dark, across a dying fire from this silent, wounded man. She felt less alone than she ever had in her entire life. The fire was more than just a source of heat. It was a connection, a small, brave light of understanding in an endless, echoing darkness. The fragile truce they had found in the firelight was stolen by the sky. For another day they traveled, but a change had come to the air. The vast, indifferent blue was gone, replaced by a low, bruised ceiling of gray clouds that scudded in from the north, carrying the smell of rain and a damp, penetrating chill. By afternoon, the first drops began to fall, cold and sparse. Within an hour, it was a downpour, a relentless slanting rain that turned the red dust to a slick, clinging mud and soaked them to the bone in minutes. The world was reduced to a miserable, gray blur. The rain plastered Evelyn's hair to her scalp and streamed down her face, mingling with the tears of sheer misery she could not stop. Her dress, the same dark wool she had worn since her exile, became a leaden weight, clinging to her skin and leaching the warmth from her body. The cold was a physical assault, far worse than the dry chill of the desert nights. This was a wet, insidious cold that found its way into her joints, her very marrow, making her feel as if she would never be warm again. They trudged on, a miserable procession of shivering refugees. The sheep bleated pitifully, and even the horses seemed to lower their heads against the onslaught. Kaya moved at the front, a grim, indomitable figure, his face set, his eyes scanning the washed-out landscape for any sign of shelter. Evelyn's newfound strength began to fail her. A deep, shuddering chill took root in her body, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the external cold. Her steps became clumsy, and she stumbled often in the treacherous mud. Tala tried to support her, her own face pinched and pale, but Evelyn was becoming a dead weight. At last, just as the light began to fail, Kaya found a place. It was a narrow, deep fissure in a rock face, almost completely hidden by a thicket of stubborn, thorny bushes. It was not large, barely big enough for all of them to huddle inside, but it was dry. They crowded into the space, a damp, steaming collection of bodies, the smell of wet wool and wet earth filling the air. Evelyn collapsed onto the sandy floor of the shelter, her body racked with violent shivers. Her mind felt foggy, detached, the voices of the others a low, meaningless murmur. Tala knelt beside her, touching her forehead, and then drew her hand back with a sharp, worried intake of breath. She spoke quickly to Kaya, her voice laced with alarm. Kaya came to her, his movements swift and sure. He knelt in front of her, his presence filling her blurry vision. He placed his hand on her forehead, and his touch, though gentle, seemed to scorch her skin. Her body was on fire from within, even as she felt frozen to the core. A fever had taken hold, a fierce, raging inferno born of exhaustion and exposure. He looked into her eyes, and she saw a flicker of something she had never seen there before, a raw, unguarded fear. The sight of it terrified her more than her own condition. He spoke to Tala, his voice a low, urgent command. He needed a fire. Now, he needed dry blankets, while others scrambled to find enough dry tinder in the damp recesses of the cave. Kaya turned his attention back to Evelyn. Her clothes, he knew, were a death sentence. The wet fabric was a cold shroud, drawing the life and heat from her body, feeding the fever. She had to get out of them. He took one of the driest sheepskins and laid it out near the back of the small cave. in the most protected spot. He returned to her side as a small, sputtering fire began to catch, its weak, smoky light pushing back the damp gloom. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft but firm, pulling her from the feverish fog. "You must take off the wet clothes." The words barely registered at first. She looked at him, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Undress here, in front of everyone. The ingrained modesty of a lifetime. The strictures of a world she no longer belonged to. Rose up in a confused, protesting wave. Her mind was a maelstrom of shivering and heat, of fear and a profound, bone-deep weariness. The other people, understanding the situation with an innate, quiet delicacy, turned their backs. Old Bear began to chant in a low, humming voice, a prayer for healing. Tala and the other women created a small, human screen, busying themselves with arranging the sleeping rolls, granting a small, fragile illusion of privacy. But Evelyn's hands would not cooperate. Her fingers were numb and clumsy, unable to work the small, difficult buttons at her throat and cuffs. A wave of helpless frustration washed over her, and a weak, dry sob escaped her lips. She was useless, a child, unable to even perform this simple, necessary task. Kaya saw her struggle. He moved closer, his large frame blocking the view of the others, creating a shelter of his own body. He did not speak. His hands, sure and steady, came to her throat. For a moment she flinched, the memory of other male hands, cold and possessive, flashing through her mind. But his touch was different. It was impersonal, yet infinitely gentle. With deft, careful movements, he undid the small buttons at her collar. He worked his way down the front of her bodice, his knuckles occasionally brushing the cold, damp skin of her chest. She held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. When the last button was free, he paused. He looked at her, his gaze holding hers, giving her a chance to protest, to refuse. But she had no strength left for refusal. All she had left was a desperate, primal need to trust someone, to trust him. The fever was making her dizzy, the small cave tilting and swaying around her. The firelight seemed to pulse with her own frantic heartbeat. She was utterly exposed, stripped of her strength, her health, her pride. All she had left was this one last shred of dignity, this final, deeply personal boundary. Her voice was a thread of sound, a dry, rustling whisper, barely audible above the howling of the wind outside the cave. "Where should I undress?" The question was a surrender. It was the last wall of her old life crumbling to dust. It was an admission that she could not save herself, that she was placing her life, her very being, into his hands. Kaya looked at her, and in that moment, the world outside the cave, the rain, the soldiers, the past, it all ceased to exist. There was only the firelight and the raw vulnerability in her fever-bright eyes. He saw not a white woman, not an object of shame or desire, but a soul as lost and battered as his own, seeking sanctuary. His hand came up, not to her clothes, but to her face. His thumb gently stroked her cheek, and then his fingers cupped her chin, lifting it so that her eyes were forced to meet his. His gaze was steady, clear, and filled with a fierce, protective tenderness that stole the breath from her lungs. He spoke, his voice low and certain, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her illness. "Right beside me." The words were not a command. They were a promise. They were an answer to a question she had not even known she was asking. It meant, "Here, in the warmth of this fire I have made for you. Here, where I can keep you safe. Here, where you are not alone." It meant that the space beside him was no longer his or hers, but theirs, a shared territory of survival and trust. A single tear traced a hot path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow or of fear, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. The trust she had given was answered with a gentleness she had never known. He had not taken advantage of her weakness. He had honored it. Slowly, carefully, he helped her. He peeled the wet, heavy fabric of the dress from her shoulders, his movements deliberate and respectful. She shivered as the cold air hit her damp skin, and he immediately pulled a dry, rough woven blanket around her, tucking it tightly under her chin. Working beneath the blanket, he helped her out of the rest of her wet underthings, his touch always brief, always purposeful. He did not look at her body. He looked at her face, his dark eyes never leaving hers, as if to assure her that he saw her, the woman, not the flesh. When it was done, and she was wrapped in a cocoon of dry wool and sheepskin, he gently guided her to the pallet he had prepared. He piled more skins over her, trying to build a fortress of warmth against the fever's chill. He sat beside her, a silent, unmovable guardian. The firelight cast their two shadows onto the cave wall, where they merged and danced as one. Outside, the wind howled its lonely, desolate song, but inside the small, warm cave, two souls who had been cast out by the world found their shelter not in the rock, but in each other. It was a moment of profound and quiet healing, an unspoken vow made in the heart of the storm. They had chosen to trust, not just to live, but to begin, in some small, fragile way, to love. The fever left Evelyn feeling hollowed out and strangely light, as if she had been remade from a finer, more fragile clay. But in the weeks that followed, as she regained her strength in a new, even more secluded canyon, she discovered a new resilience within that fragility. The small band of Navajo treated her differently now. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. She had faced death and survived. She was no longer just the white woman. She was a part of their story, a thread woven into the fabric of their flight. Her connection with Kaya had deepened into a silent, profound understanding. Words were often unnecessary, a shared glance across the fire, the way he would leave a particularly sweet piece of roasted corn for her, the way she would ensure the bandage on his healing leg was clean and tight. These small acts became their language. They were two solitary beings who had found a quiet orbit around each other, a shared center of gravity in a hostile universe. She taught him more English words, and he taught her the names of the constellations, the stories of the star people who watched over the desert at night. In these moments of peace, it was almost possible to forget they were being hunted. But the world outside their stone sanctuary had not forgotten them. A rumor, carried on the wind like a poisonous seed, had taken root in the scattered settlements and mining camps of the territory. It was a strange and tantalizing tale, whispered over glasses of cheap whiskey and traded between trappers and prospectors. A white woman, a lady by the looks of her, was living with a band of renegade Navajo. Some said she had been captured, others that she had gone wild, a willing convert to a savage life. The story changed with each telling, but two facts remained constant: she was white, and she was with them. The rumor eventually reached the ears of a man named Silas Rourke. He was a bounty hunter, a man who made his living from the misery of others. With a face like a slab of raw meat and eyes as small and cold as a pig's. The bounty on Navajo warriors was insultingly low, but a white woman, a captive to be rescued. She was a prize. She meant a reward from the army, a story in the newspapers, and perhaps even a handsome payment from a grateful, wealthy family back east. Accompanied by 3 other men of similar character and a reluctant patrol of 4 soldiers from a nearby fort, Rourke set out to claim his prize. The news of their approach came, as it always did, from a breathless scout. But this time, the fear was different. It was sharper, more specific. They were not just a patrol. They were trackers, led by a man who knew the land and was hunting for more than just renegades. He was hunting for her. The familiar, grim ritual of escape began again. But this time, a cold certainty settled in Evelyn's heart. It was her presence that had brought this. Her alien face, her white skin, was a beacon that drew this danger to the people who had saved her. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in her gut. By the second night of their flight, Kaya knew they were not shaking the trackers. They were too good, too persistent. They could not keep running as a group. The old and the young were slowing them down. He made a decision, his face hard and impassive in the moonlight. He would lead them away. He would create a false trail, a path so obvious and tempting that the hunters would have no choice but to follow. He explained the plan to Old Bear and the other men in low, guttural tones. Then he came to Evelyn. He stood before her, the weight of his decision in his eyes. He told her she was to go with Tala and the others, to a place of high caves he had shown her, a place where they could hide and wait. "No," the word escaped her lips before she could stop it. "I will come with you." His expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. "You cannot," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You are the one they are looking for. They will follow me. Your place is with my sister, with the children. You will keep them safe." He reached out and took the small bundle she carried, and from it he removed the book of poetry, her last link to her old life. He tucked it inside his own shirt. "I will keep this for you," he said. It was a promise that he intended to return. Then he did something that stunned her. He pushed a rifle into her hands. It was a heavy, long-barreled Winchester, its wooden stock worn smooth with use. She stared at it, at the alien shape of it, the cold, deadly weight. "I do not know how," she whispered, her voice trembling. He placed her hands correctly on the stock and the barrel. "You point," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And you pull. Do not think, just pull." He looked deep into her eyes. "You are stronger than you believe." He said, "Now go." He turned and melted into the darkness before she could say another word. She stood for a long moment, the rifle a terrible, foreign weight in her hands. Then she turned and followed Tala and the others, a silent, obedient ghost moving through the moon-drenched canyons. For a day, she did as he had commanded, herding the children, helping the older women, her mind a numb haze of dread. They reached the high caves, a defensible, hidden sanctuary, but there was no peace for her there. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a bird, made her heart leap into her throat. She stared out at the vast, empty landscape, her eyes searching for a sign, for a puff of smoke, for anything. The sound, when it came, was faint, a distant pop that was almost swallowed by the wind, and then another, sharper this time. Gunfire. The sound broke the spell of her obedience. He was in trouble. They had found him. A cold, clear certainty washed over her, sweeping away all fear, all hesitation. She turned to Tala, who was staring at her, her eyes wide with understanding and dread. "I am going back," Evelyn said, her voice a stranger to her own ears, hard and steady. Tala started to protest, but Evelyn cut her off. "You will keep them safe here," she said, her words echoing Kaya's own command. She handed the rifle to one of the younger men. "No," she said, taking it back. "This is mine." She looked at the small, terrified group huddled in the mouth of the cave. She was one of them now, and she would fight for them. She would fight for him. She moved with a speed and certainty she did not know she possessed. She did not feel the thorns that tore at her dress or the sharp rocks that bruised her feet. She followed the sound, her senses preternaturally sharp, every bit the desert creature she had been forced to become. She found them in a shallow, rocky arroyo. Kaya was trapped, his back against a sheer rock wall. A dark stain was spreading across his left shoulder. He held a knife in his hand, his body tensed, a wounded wolf at bay. Before him, Silas Rourke sat on his horse, a long rifle resting across his saddle, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. 2 of his men and 1 soldier were with him, their own weapons drawn. "There he is," Rourke said, his voice a lazy, brutal drawl. "And the wound is a nice touch. Makes him easier to transport. We will take him alive. The army pays for live ones." "What about the woman?" the soldier asked, his face young and nervous. Rourke spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We will find the woman," he said, his eyes gluttonous. "I'm sure our boy here will tell us where she is. Eventually." Evelyn watched from behind a cluster of boulders 100 yards away. Her breath was a fire in her lungs. She saw Kaya's face, the pain and defiance warring there. She saw the smug cruelty on Rourke's face. These were the men of her world, and they had come to destroy the only thing of value she had left. She lifted the rifle. It was impossibly heavy. She rested the barrel on top of the boulder to steady it, her knuckles white. She pressed the cold stock against her cheek, just as he had shown her. She looked down the long barrel, trying to line up the small metal sights. Her target was a man on a horse, a man who was laughing, a man who was about to take Kaya from her. "You point and you pull. Do not think." Her world narrowed to the small space between the sights. The wind, the sun, the pounding of her own blood in her ears. It all faded away. There was only the front sight, and the dark shape of Silas Rourke's chest. Her finger found the trigger. It felt cold, alien. She closed her eyes for a split second, a silent prayer to a god she no longer believed in, and squeezed. The rifle exploded against her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force that sent a jolt of pain through her entire body. The noise was a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. For a moment, she was blind and deaf, lost in the acrid smell of gunpowder. When her vision cleared, Silas Rourke was no longer on his horse. He was on the ground, a still, crumpled heap in the red dust. The horse, terrified, was rearing and screaming. The other men were staring, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief, trying to find the source of the shot. The moment of confusion was all Kaya needed. Ignoring the fire in his shoulder, he launched himself forward, a blur of motion. He drove his knife into the leg of the nearest bounty hunter, who screamed and fell. The young soldier, panicked, fired his pistol wildly, the bullet whining off the rock far above Evelyn's head. Kaya was on him in a flash, the butt of his knife connecting with the soldier's temple with a sickening thud. The soldier collapsed. The last man, seeing it was now 2 against 1, turned and fled, scrambling back up the arroyo the way he had come. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the groans of the wounded bounty hunter and the nervous stamping of the horse. Kaya stood over the unconscious soldier, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his wounded shoulder into the dust. He looked up, his eyes finding her immediately. A question, an exclamation, a universe of meaning in a single, stunned look. She stumbled down from the rocks, the heavy rifle suddenly feeling as if it were made of lead. She walked past the moaning man on the ground, her eyes fixed on the still form of Silas Rourke. There was a dark, wet patch spreading across his chest. His eyes were open, staring at the empty sky with a look of profound surprise. She had done that. She, Evelyn, a woman who had once fainted at the sight of a bleeding finger, had taken a human life. She reached Kaya, and her legs finally gave out. She sank to her knees in the dust, the rifle clattering to the ground beside her. And then she began to weep. It was not the weeping of a frightened woman. It was a storm, a hurricane of grief and rage and a terrifying, exhilarating triumph. She cried for the woman she had been, the woman who had lived in a world of rules and books and believed in a gentle civilization. That woman was as dead as the man lying in the dust, and in her place was this new person, this stranger who knew the feel of a rifle stock against her cheek and the smell of gunpowder and the finality of death. She was crying because she had survived, not by being rescued, but by her own hand. She had fought back, and in that terrible, brutal act, she had finally, irrevocably, found her own freedom. The echoes of the rifle shot faded, leaving a silence that was more profound and terrifying than the noise itself. Kaya stood over the unconscious soldier, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face pale beneath its sun-darkened hue. He looked at Evelyn, who was kneeling in the dust, and then at the dead man she had shot, and a complex, unreadable expression passed over his face. The moment of shock was shattered by a groan from the bounty hunter with a knife in his leg. The world, which had seemed to stop, crashed back into motion with brutal urgency. The man who had fled would bring others. The soldiers from the fort would not let the death of one of their own, or even one of their temporary allies, go unanswered. This small bloody arroyo was now the most dangerous place on earth for them. Kaya moved, his body a study in controlled pain. He knelt beside Evelyn, his good hand resting for a moment on her trembling shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of command, a silent order to rise, to move, to survive. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust, and saw the grim necessity in his eyes. Her storm of weeping subsided, replaced by a cold, clear focus. They worked with a grim, silent efficiency. Kaya retrieved his knife, then used the man's own belt to bind the wound in his leg, a gesture that was both practical and, in its own way, merciful. He would not bleed to death before he was found. The unconscious soldier was left as he was. They had no way to carry him, and no reason to. From the dead, they took what they needed: the rifle, ammunition, a waterskin, and the man's horse, a sturdy-looking bay that would be a welcome addition. By the time Tala, Old Bear, and the others, drawn by the distant sound of the shots, found them, the scene was one of quiet, desperate preparation. Old Bear's eyes took in everything in a single, sweeping glance: the dead bounty hunter, the bound man, the blood on Kaya's shoulder, and Evelyn, her face set like flint, reloading the Winchester rifle with steady, deliberate movements. He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not a white woman, not a burden, but a warrior. His expression of stern disapproval softened into something akin to awe. He gave a single, slow nod. The trouble she had brought, she had also ended, for now. There was no debate. They all knew what came next. To stay in the territory was to be hunted down and killed. The soldiers would come in force, and they would not stop until they had vengeance. There was only one direction left to them, one desperate hope. South, towards Mexico, a line on a map, a different country, a place where the long arm of the United States Army could not, they hoped, reach them. The journey was an exercise in pure misery. Kaya's wound was far worse than he had let on. The bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder, and by the second day, a fever had set in. A hot, consuming fire that left him weak and disoriented. He refused to ride at first, his pride a stubborn, foolish thing, but he stumbled so often that the others had to force him onto the horse's back. He would ride for an hour, his body swaying with each step of the animal, his teeth clenched against the pain, until he would slide from the saddle, insisting he could walk. The roles had reversed completely. Evelyn was now the one who led, the one who cared for him. She was the one who scouted for water, who chose their resting places, who kept a constant, vigilant watch on their back trail. She cleaned and dressed his wound twice a day, her hands gentle but firm, her heart a cold knot of fear every time she saw the angry, inflamed edges of the injury. The fever raged, and at night he would shiver and murmur in his own language. Lost in a world of delirium and pain, she would sit by his side, sponging his face with a damp cloth, her presence a constant, silent vigil. On the fourth night of their flight, they were camped in a shallow, sandy wash, the moon a brilliant, cold disk in a black sky. It cast an ethereal, silver light over the landscape, bleaching the sand to the color of bone and turning the rocks into haunting, skeletal shapes. Kaya was finally sleeping, a restless, shallow sleep, but sleep nonetheless. The fever seemed to have broken, leaving him drenched in sweat and terribly weak. Evelyn watched him, her body aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle and bone. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the moon, he looked terribly vulnerable. The hard lines of his face were softened, his lips slightly parted, his breathing a soft, unsteady rhythm. This was the man who had saved her, who had taught her to survive, who had shown her a kindness she had never known. And now, he was helpless, his life held in the fragile balance of her own burgeoning skills. A choice, stark and clear as the moonlight on the sand, presented itself to her. She could leave. The thought came unbidden, a cold, rational whisper in the back of her mind. She could take a horse, a water skin, and the rifle, and ride east. She could find a town, a settlement. She could invent a story, a tale of capture and miraculous escape. Perhaps they would even believe her. Her name was Evelyn Thorne, and she was a civilized woman from Boston. Surely they would see that. She could go back to a world of soft beds and regular meals, a world of books and polite conversation, a world where she did not have to kill to survive. She thought of that world, and a wave of revulsion so powerful it made her stomach churn washed over her. What was that civilization she would be returning to? A civilization that cast out its own for a whisper of impropriety. A civilization that burned villages and stole children in the name of progress. A civilization of men like Jedediah Thorne and Silas Rourke. Men who saw the world as a thing to be owned and bent to their will. She saw it now for what it was. A beautiful, elaborate cage. Its bars forged from hypocrisy and gilded with lies. The freedom it offered was the freedom to conform, to obey, to be silent. It was no freedom at all. Her gaze returned to Kaya. His hand, which had been resting on his chest, slipped to his side, his fingers brushing against the sand. She thought of his silent strength, of the way he had looked at her across the fire, of the feel of his hand on her chin in that dark, rainy cave. He had never asked her to be anything other than what she was. He had simply made space for her to become the person she was meant to be. He had seen her, not as a wife or a possession or a liability, but as a soul, worthy of saving, worthy of respect. To leave him now would be a betrayal far greater than the one she had suffered. It would be a betrayal of herself, of the strong, capable woman who had been born in the crucible of this harsh, beautiful land. Her old life was a ghost, a story that had happened to someone else. This desperate flight under a cold moon. This was her life now. This man, this wounded, sleeping warrior, he was her life now. She used to dream of freedom. The thought came to her with the clarity of a ringing bell. In her gilded cage in Boston, she had dreamed of escaping, of being her own person, of a life that was hers to command. She had thought freedom was a place, a destination, a state of being where she was no longer bound by the rules of others. She had achieved that, in the most brutal way imaginable. She was utterly, terrifyingly free. She was bound to no one and nothing. She could go anywhere, do anything. But the vast, empty freedom of the desert was not what she craved. Her dream had changed. It had found a new shape, a new focus. It was no longer a vague and abstract yearning. It had a face, a name. It had dark, quiet eyes and a rare, almost imperceptible smile. She leaned closer to him, her breath a small white cloud in the cold night air. The world was asleep. The only witnesses the silent moon and the listening sand. She whispered the words, a vow made to his sleeping soul and to the deepest parts of her own. I used to dream of freedom. Now I just dream of you. She reached out and her fingers gently brushed against his. His skin was cool, the fever finally gone. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a quiet certainty that eclipsed all fear and doubt. The price of this life, this love, was a future of constant running, of forever looking over her shoulder. It was a life lived in the shadows, on the edges of the world. The price of this freedom was everything she had ever known, and in the silent, silvered light of the desert moon, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she would pay it gladly. The river was a muddy, brown serpent, swollen and angry from the recent rains. It was the line, the final barrier between the past and a future they could not yet imagine. For 3 days they had followed its course southward, a small, weary band of fugitives, and now they had reached a place where the banks were low enough to attempt a crossing. The water was fast and cold, a churning testament to the power of the land. Kaya slid from the horse's back, his movement slow and deliberate. He stood for a moment, his hand on the saddle to steady himself, and looked at the water. The fever was gone, but it had scoured him from the inside out, leaving him weak, a hollowed-out version of the man he had been. The wound in his shoulder was a constant, draining ache, and his face was drawn and pale, his skin stretched tight over the elegant bones of his face. He looked at the rushing water not with fear, but with a kind of calm, analytical detachment. It was simply the next obstacle, the next thing to be overcome. Evelyn stood beside him, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She saw the tremor in his hands, the slight sway of his body that he tried so hard to conceal. She knew he did not have the strength to make it across on his own. She touched his arm, and he turned to look at her. The exhaustion in his eyes was a deep, dark pool, but behind it, there was a steady light, a quiet flame of trust that was meant only for her. Old Bear led the sheep and goats into the water first, the animals bleating in protest as the cold current tugged at their legs. Tala and the other women followed, their faces set with determination, holding the children high. Evelyn watched them go, her gaze fixed on Kaya. When it was their turn, he made to step into the water, but she put a hand on his chest, stopping him. "Let me help you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. A flicker of his old pride surfaced in his eyes, a stubborn refusal to be seen as weak. But then he looked at her face, at the unshakable resolve he saw there, and he relented. He gave a single, slow nod. They entered the water together, the shock of the cold so intense it stole Evelyn's breath. The current was a powerful, living thing, trying to pull her feet out from under her. The muddy riverbed was treacherous, sucking at her boots. She wrapped one arm around Kaya's waist, her other hand gripping his arm, and he leaned on her, his weight a heavy, precious burden. She felt the strain in her own muscles, the burn of the cold in her legs, but she did not falter. Every step was a battle, a small victory against the river's relentless pull. He was a dead weight for much of the crossing, his head lolling against her shoulder, his energy completely spent. She whispered to him, her words a meaningless stream of encouragement, a prayer to the river, to the sky, to the spirit of this land she had come to both fear and love. Just a little farther. Stay with me. We are almost there. When they finally staggered onto the opposite bank, into the muddy soil of Mexico, she collapsed onto her knees, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling with cold and exertion. He slid down beside her, his back against a gnarled cottonwood tree, his eyes closed. For a moment, she was terrified that the river had been the final battle, the one he could not win. Then his eyes opened, and he looked at her. A faint, weary smile touched his lips. It was a smile of profound peace, of a man who had finally reached the shore after a long and brutal storm. They rested for the remainder of the day, their soaked clothes steaming in the weak afternoon sun. The land on this side of the river was different, The red rock and stark mesas of the territory gave way to a gentler landscape of rolling hills and a softer, greener vegetation. The air itself seemed lighter, less oppressive. They were across, they were safe. But Evelyn knew, with a certainty that was a cold stone in her heart, that the journey had cost him everything. He grew weaker as the days passed. He no longer tried to walk, but rode the bay horse. His body slumped forward, his hands resting on the pommel of the saddle. But a strange and beautiful serenity had settled over him. The hard, watchful mask he had worn for so long had fallen away. The pain was still there. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, but it no longer seemed to touch the core of him. He would watch the landscape with a quiet appreciation, his gaze lingering on the shape of a cloud or the flight of a hawk. And he would smile, those small, private smiles that were meant only for her, smiles that held a world of unspoken love and a deep, accepting sorrow. One afternoon, after a soft morning rain had washed the world clean, they came over the crest of a low hill and stopped. The valley below them was a miracle, a breathtaking carpet of wildflowers, a riot of color that seemed to have sprung from the damp earth in a single, joyous explosion. There were fields of purple verbena, golden poppies, and the fiery red of Indian paintbrush, all swaying gently in the breeze. The air was thick with the sweet, clean scent of their blossoms. It was a symbol, a promise. The rain that had brought her to the edge of death had also brought this impossible beauty into being. It was a testament to the desert's resilience, to its ability to bring forth new life from the harshest of conditions. Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. Life would go on. Beauty would continue to bloom. That evening, they made camp under a sprawling mesquite tree at the edge of the field of flowers. The sunset was a soft watercolor of pink and gold, and a gentle peace settled over the small group. Kaya was lying on a bed of blankets, his head propped against a saddle. He seemed more lucid than he had in days, his eyes clear and calm. Evelyn knelt beside him, a bowl of thin broth in her hands. He drank a little, to please her, and then pushed the bowl gently away. She sat with him as the sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars appeared, sharp and brilliant in the clear air. She knew their time was short. She could feel it in the way he watched her, as if trying to memorize every line and shadow of her face. She wanted to fill the silence with a lifetime of words, to tell him everything he had come to mean to her, but the words would not come. Instead, she spoke of a dream. She told him about a place she had been imagining, a small house made of adobe, the color of the earth itself. It would have a red clay roof and a thick wooden door, and a small porch where they could sit in the evenings. There would be a corral for his horse, and a small garden where she would grow corn and squash and the bright red chilies she had seen hanging to dry. She described it in a low, soft voice, her words a gentle lullaby, painting a picture of a life they would never have. "And in this place," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, "no one would ever have to run again." She finished, and a profound, aching silence fell between them. He had been listening, his eyes never leaving her face. He raised his hand, his movement slow and weak, and she took it in both of hers. His skin was cool, his grip faint, but his thumb managed to make a small, caressing circle on the back of her hand. He looked at her, and his smile was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing she had ever seen. It was a smile of pure love, of complete understanding, of a peace that passed all comprehension. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry, rustling whisper, the last breath of a desert wind. "We already found it," he said, "right here." His eyes held hers for a long, timeless moment. He saw her, and she saw him, and in that shared gaze was the adobe house, the garden, the quiet evenings, the entire lifetime of peace they had found not in a place, but in each other. His hand went limp in hers. A soft, final sigh escaped his lips, and the light the beautiful, steady light in his dark eyes. Went out. He was gone. She sat with him in her arms as the moon rose, its silver light bathing the field of flowers, turning them into a ghostly, beautiful garden. She did not weep. The grief was too vast, too deep for tears. It was a hollow, silent ocean within her. He had died in her arms, at peace, in a place of impossible beauty. He was free. Evelyn did not go back. She did not seek out her own people. There was nothing for her there. His people were her people now. She stayed with them, this small, resilient family bound together by loss and love. She continued to live in the hidden canyons and quiet valleys of this new country. And she found a new purpose, in the satchel she still carried. Beside the book of poetry he had kept for her were the horn books and primers of her old life. She began to teach the children. She drew letters in the sand with a stick and taught them the English words they would need to navigate the dangerous new world that was encroaching on their own. She taught them to read, to write, to count, and in the evenings, around the fire, she told them stories. She told them of a brave warrior who had chosen compassion over bitterness, and of a woman from a faraway city who had been cast out and left to die. She told them a story of survival, of trust, of a love that was stronger than armies and borders, a love that had bloomed, fierce and beautiful, in the harshest of deserts. She became the keeper of their legend, ensuring that the story of Kaya Nez and the white woman who loved him would never be lost, but would be whispered on the wind, a timeless song of the human heart. The son of the high Sonoran desert, in the early years of a new century, was a different son from the one that had tried to kill her. It was still a powerful, elemental force, but its light now seemed less a hammer and more a benediction, warming the ancient stones and coaxing a stubborn, vibrant life from the arid soil. The world had changed. The blue-coated soldiers came less frequently now. The lines on the maps had been drawn more firmly, and the long war of attrition had settled into a sullen, weary peace. In a hidden canyon, a place of deep shadows and a year-round trickle of sweet water from a hidden spring, a new generation was growing. They were children born in this fragile freedom, their memories not of flight and fire, but of the stories told around the evening cook fire. Their favorite storyteller was an old woman with hair the color of spun moonlight and eyes that held the deep, quiet light of the desert sky at dusk. Her face was a beautiful map of a long and difficult life, her skin the color of tanned leather, creased with 1,000 lines of sorrow and laughter. Her hands, resting in her lap, were not the soft, pale hands of a Boston lady, but the gnarled, capable hands of a woman who knew how to grind corn, how to set a snare, how to clean a rifle, and how to gently soothe a fevered child. To the children who gathered at her feet, she was known by a name of deep respect in their language. To the few traders and travelers who heard whispers of her, she was a legend, a ghost of the old days. They called her the Desert Widow. She sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock, a brightly woven blanket around her shoulders, and the children fell silent as she began to speak. Her voice was low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone, but it held them rapt. She never spoke of herself in the first person. The story was a sacred thing, a legend that belonged to all of them now. She told them of a time, long ago, when the world was a harder place. She spoke of a woman who came from the east, from a city so big and crowded that you could not see the stars at night. This woman, she said, was a captive long before she ever saw the desert. She was a prisoner in a fine dress, locked in a house with glass windows. Her heart a small, quiet thing she was not allowed to claim as her own. She was cast out by her own people, left for the sun to claim, because she carried a secret crime in her heart, the crime of wanting to be happy. The children's eyes were wide. They could not imagine such a place, or such a crime. Then the old woman's voice would soften, and she would tell them of the warrior. He was a man of the Dine, a man whose heart had been scarred by loss and hardened by war. He had every reason to hate the world the woman came from. He had seen its cruelty firsthand, had lost his own family to its unthinking brutality. He could have left her to the desert, a small and fitting justice for the sins of her people. But his spirit, she would say, was stronger than his bitterness. He chose compassion over vengeance. He chose to save a life rather than to savor a death. He chose to walk in beauty, even when the world around him was ugly. She would tell them of their journey together, of the canyon of ghosts where the woman was a feared intruder, of her clumsy first attempts to survive, of the flint and steel and the cactus and the rabbit. The children would laugh at the image of the fine lady from the east, her hands raw and bleeding, struggling to make a fire. But the old woman's smile was gentle. It was a story not of failure, but of beginning. She spoke of the fire they shared in the night, the first time they had traded the stories of their broken worlds. It was here, she explained, that they learned a great truth. A heart can be broken in a fine house with glass windows just as easily as it can be broken in a burned village. Pain was a language they both understood. Her voice would drop to a near whisper as she described the cold rain, the fever, the dark cave. She told of the woman's shame and fear, and of the warrior's great and gentle strength. She told them how he had wrapped the woman in dry blankets, how he had guarded her through the long night, his presence a shield against the dark. Their love, she told the children, was not born in sunshine and soft words. It was born in a storm, forged in fear and fever, a small, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished by the cold. It did not ask for permission, the old woman would say, her eyes looking past the children, into a distance only she could see. It did not need a church or a law or the approval of others. It was as real as the stone beneath their feet, and as vast as the sky above. It was a world they built for two, a sanctuary made of trust. That is the only kind of greatness that matters. And she would tell them of the hunt, of the cruel men who came to steal the woman away and claim a reward. Her voice would fill with a quiet, fierce pride as she described the woman lifting a rifle for the first time, her hands shaking, her heart a wild drum in her chest. She told them how the woman had fought back, not for herself, but for the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly alive. She had taken a life to save a life, a terrible and necessary act that had severed the last thread connecting her to the world she had left behind. Freedom, she explained to the wide-eyed children, was not a place on a map. It was not a border you could cross to escape your troubles. She knew this because she had crossed that border. True freedom, she said, was the choice to live by the truth in your own heart, even if it meant leaving the rest of the world behind, even if it cost you everything. Finally, she would tell them of the end of their journey, of the muddy river, of the field of wildflowers that bloomed after the rain. Her voice would grow soft and tender as she described the warrior's last moments, his weakness, his peaceful smile. She would share his final words, the one she had carried in her heart for all these years. We already found it, right here. The children would be silent for a long time afterward, the weight of the story settling over them. They knew she was the woman in the story. They knew she had stayed, had become one of them, their teacher, their storyteller, the keeper of their history. As the old woman finished her tale, the last of the sun's light painted the high cliffs in strokes of fire and rose. A cool evening breeze whispered down from the high country, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood trees that grew by the spring. And on the wind, a melody began, a soft, humming sound from the old woman's lips. It was a Navajo song, a song of walking in beauty, the one the warrior had sung to her in the darkness as they fled, the one he had taught her by the night fire. The melody carried the legacy of the desert. It spoke of survival, of the beauty that can be found in the harshest of places, of a love that could cross the borders of race and culture and hatred. It was a song of a freedom found not in escape, but in connection. She had long ago forgiven the husband who had cast her out, and the people on the wagon train who had turned their backs. Their judgment seemed small and distant now, the actions of frightened people in a world she no longer understood. But the hardest forgiveness, the one that had taken a lifetime to learn, was for the foolish, frightened girl she had once been. The girl who had believed in cages, who had not known her own strength. In forgiving that girl, she had finally, completely, come home. The desert had not been her prison. It had been her salvation. And in its vast, silent embrace, she had learned not just how to love a man, but how to love the fierce, resilient, and finally, free woman she had become. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.